So, what was it like on Robben Island during the years you were there?
In the wake of the Sharpeville massacre and the turn to the armed struggle, which now practically all organizations who were involved in the struggle of apartheid had members who begin to debate the need to launch, to become involved in violent forms of struggle. Robben Island was set aside by the regime to become a prison for political prisoners in 1962. Until then, it had had a checkered career, but is shrouded in all sorts of false information, a lack of information in our history. It was a place where it became a prison for political prisoners of Javanese origin in the 1800s. And so, one of the places where we were made to work digging for lime was a quarry which showed some remnants of evidence that it had been a quarry that had been worked at by Javanese prisoners. Of course, it had a history also of being a prison for many resistors in the African struggle before the ANC was formed. And a number of leaders, chiefs of our communities were imprisoned on Robben Island. One of them died while trying to escape from Robben Island, Chief Makana. So by the time we arrived, certain changes took place. Firstly, the 1962-63 group, including Mandela, who was sentenced first in 1962, when he went to Robben Island, there were some warders who were of the color of from the colored community. But as it became more and more a prison for all our political prisoners, the prison staff became entirely white, and all colors were removed for fear that they would empathize and sympathize with us political prisoners. The treatment in those days was extremely harsh. Groups that had arrived in Robben Island were received with what was called a carry on, where the warders indiscriminately attacked prisoners with batons and pick handles. The intention was to destroy our self esteem and our and to make us a forgotten people. I happened to be fortunate in being put in the section where Mandela and Sisulu were kept in the single cells where we had individual cells, and there were a group of about 30 to 35 that were kept in that section. The other prisoners were kept in communal cells, and their treatment was even harsher than ours. But the abiding message that came out of Robben Island was that the apartheid regime had decided to make us a forgotten people. And it hoped that people would forget us. The laws prohibited any newspaper, any media from quoting or carrying even a photograph of any political prisoner. You were prohibited from discussing conditions in prison. And we had a white comrade who served in Pretoria, who on his release publicly went and explained what was happening and the treatment we were suffering. And for that, he was arrested again, and he and the journalist who published that report were sentenced to imprisonment. So that was the first thing. Make these people forgotten. We have failed to execute them by law. They are now imprisoned there, and particularly, let's make Mandela a forgotten person. The second thing was, besides the physical torture and assaults, a psychological effort to destroy you. You were originally allowed one letter every 6 months and one visit per 6 months. And the letter could not be more than 500 words. And often it was so censored that what you received was disfigured and you could not see anything besides a greeting and a closure from the person writing to you. Your visits were monitored. My mother could not speak English properly, but it was a requirement that your visit had to be conducted in English or Afrikaans. And so All these efforts were, were found us in a situation where we had to decide how we conducted ourselves in prison. And I must say, to the credit of members of the African National Congress and the Congress movement, from whichever prison we got into on our way to Robben Island, we found ourselves required to address every prison warder who was white as boss, which means boss. And instinctively, the overwhelming majority of us automatically decided on our own that we would not do so. By the time we reached Robben Island, that practice that we would not call them boss had settled, and we were prepared to say in Afrikaans, meneer, meaning sir, but not to go beyond that. Mandela, of course, was at the forefront, and he clearly had decided from day one to set the terms on which we were being imprisoned. We were required, and he recounts, and it's available in audio, where he recounts these incidents in an audio tape which is housed at the Mandela Foundation, where in the 1990s he was recalling those conditions. And he says that when he arrived in Robben Island with three other prisoners and they disembarked, they were required to walk in twos. So there were two people at the front and two at the back, surrounded by warders, and they were required to walk at a crouch and a trot, with the instruction being said in Afrikaans, hak. His group on the arrival, without talking, instinctively decided, and he certainly decided, we're not going to do that. We're going to walk upright and steadily. And so he tells the person who was next to him, John Kaitsiwa, as the warders were threatening them, he said, let's move to the front. And the two of them moved to the front and walked steadily. The warders were screaming at them, but Mandela recounts that he had come to the decision from the day of his imprisonment that he was not going to allow them to impugn his dignity and humiliate him. He said it was important that we did that. And that's the basis on which we began to wage resistance as prisoners. We were isolated from the rest of the prisoners, but we were began to clandestinely communicate. And one of the messages we received in early 65, while we in the 30 group of Mandela were still breaking stones in the quadrangle, we were informed by a person who brought the food, a fellow prisoner, that the prisoners on the other section, the majority, had gone on a hunger strike. We were at that time making representations to improve our conditions through Mandela interacting with the commanding officer. But the moment we heard about this, in the bathroom, we decided we're on strike as well. We didn't know why, what were the grievances. During that strike for hunger, many of the comrades, a few of them, let me be clear, a handful, who were on the hunger strike, were charged subsequently by the prison authorities under legislation which said that by going on hunger strike they had endangered their lives. And for that they were sentenced to additional prison terms of 3 to 6 months. That explains the conditions under which we were. But I think that the important thing that emerged for us was two things. One, that we were going to use prison as a terrain of struggle. And that is to struggle to improve our conditions to be treated like human beings and to be treated on the basis of equality as all prisoners, irrespective of the racial group that you belong to. The second thing was to hear that the struggle was continuing. And in particular, we began to pick up information about the international campaign for our release and for sanctions against South Africa. It took particular form, even though we were not allowed to receive information, It took the fact that the borders were white and South Africa whites were a crazy rugby people, and the international community was waging struggles to isolate South African sport. And so it was easy to provoke a warder while we were working at the quarry to begin to tell us what was happening in the world, because he took the greatest affront that there were these demonstrations taking place against South African rugby. So we smuggled news, but the news of resistance outside and the news of our families and comrades still remaining steadfast in spite of all the harassment. That made sure that apartheid had made a critical blunder by putting all political prisoners of color in Robben Island. Yes, the white prisoners were kept separately, and the women prisoners were kept at Barberton. But the fact that it put the majority of the prisoners in one place, of different political organizations who were rivals, but conditions in prison were such that we had no option but to unite and fight. And so, prison has this memory for me of teaching me the importance of acting collectively, of sharing ideas of how to prosecute the struggle, of interacting with people of the stature and caliber of Mandela and Sisulu. It brought, instead of crushing us, a greater determination to survive, to go out of prison and continue with the struggle.
And what was the influence of Mandela and Sisulu on you? These two, again, incredible figures in our country's history. What did they teach you during your time on Robben Island together?
Although there has been a fair amount of acknowledgement of the role of Comrade Walter Sisulu, I think he's one of the most underestimated individuals in our liberation struggle. Yes, he had only been to school up to grade 4, but he was a remarkable personality. He, he was so important to our struggle that you will see that even when the prison authorities allowed the first international visitor to Robben Island, which was a frame job to sort of praise the South African authorities. So a reporter from the UK came over and and wanted to speak to Mandela. And you have that photograph which testifies that Mandela then said and called for Walter Sisulu to be brought so that the two of them could meet this reporter. But what I learned from them is that leadership, the most important criteria for defining leadership, is the willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. To take responsibility in the sense that often we take decisions in the hope that our action will produce certain results. Most often in social struggle for change, those results are not what you desired. And quite often they are seen by people as a setback. And it is at that moment that you will have people who are in the struggle who will begin to want to look who to blame for the impasse that we've arrived at. There will be others who will want to say that when we decided on that action, he or she had opposed it. Those people disappear in history, they never become leaders. The one who becomes a leader is the one who says, I take responsibility for the consequences that have arisen and charts out a way forward. Now, Mandela epitomizes that lesson because even when he had been arrested in 1962 August, so he was in prison when the struggle continued and the decision to pursue guerrilla warfare was being taken, he was brought to that trial in 64 from prison. But he decided to take responsibility for all those actions, including what he was not involved in, because he said, I was the person who championed the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, and I take responsibility. That is the famous speech that he made where he said, if need be, I'm prepared to die. But in prison, in that process of being told to walk in a trot, when we demanded and won the right to go to work outside of the quadrangle at the Lime Court, and the 30 of us were walking in fours, in rows of four. On all sides of us, there were warders with batons screaming at us in an atmosphere of brutality that we should hark. I was in the outer edge of the column, and the whisper came through, walk slowly. Believe me, I thought that that message was totally unrealistic. I realized it was coming from Mandela, and I said to myself, it's all very well, he's somewhere in the middle, far away from the batons to give this instruction. I'm right close to the baton. And even though my mind said, follow that instruction, my muscles, my nervous system automatically began to make me walk faster because the atmosphere was filled with brutality and there were going to be batons raining on us. But what did I see? I saw Mandela work his way through the middle to the front row. From there, he was able to slow us all down. The warders kept screaming. None of us, no word came from us either to challenge them or to succumb to them. We just walked slower than ever. And I saw him, therefore, showing that leadership means that when you lead a struggle for freedom, when the people are under attack, if you're a leader, move to the front and take the blows. And that when people achieve a small victory and want to celebrate, help them, allow them to celebrate, but stand on guard so that they can celebrate freely, because maybe that's the moment when the regime may come down heavily and attack you. So you're not the participant in the celebration, you are there to enable it to happen. Those are some of the lessons that I learned from Mandela and Sisulu. And to me, the 12 years that I spent in Robben Island has been a privilege.